Dr. Fauci pled the fifth last week, and there's probably going to be a contempt of Congress vote. But what you need to remember is that almost none of the people there demanding accountability from Dr. Fauci demanded accountability from the policymakers, the ones that actually held the authority, including some of the people doing the questioning. The economy versus lives dichotomy, school closures, vaccine requirements, quarantine orders. Those are all policy decisions. Policy decisions belong to policy makers. The hearing itself settled nothing about COVID origins, and that was a very predictable outcome. The fact that Dr. Fauci pled the fifth is understandable. The chairman, Senator Rand Paul, who's also a physician, had already stated publicly that he wanted Dr. Fauci arrested, imprisoned, behind bars. That's not the posture of a probative hearing. That's a hearing with its outcome predetermined. That's not an objective place where facts are going to be weighed soberly. And you saw that. They had ready-made props, caricaturizing gain-of-function research debates, misusing the VAERS database. Senator Johnson calling mRNA vaccines genetic therapies, clearly just overtly lying, sort of implicitly also promoting hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin on that placard that they held up with the number of quote-unquote deaths from COVID vaccines. The other point is that the whole debate about lab leak versus wet market, that's not going to be settled in a Senate hearing. The only way that that gets settled is with transparency from the Chinese government about what was being done at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, what animals were being held at the market, and on gain of function specifically. At that time, and there's questions about NIH awards and subawardees, there was no moratorium on gain of function research. There had been a moratorium that dated back to debates over bird flu and some bird flu experiments, but that was gone. Gain of function research is something that deserves a lot of public policy debate. It is a very controversial topic in the field with people on different sides. Unclear where to draw the line. What is dangerous gain of function research versus not dangerous gain of function research? How do you weigh the value of the knowledge that you get that might help condition preparations for an emerging infectious disease or a pandemic against the risk? These are real issues, but none of that really got debated there. What you saw was scapegoating of Dr. Fauci. And if you go back to what I said earlier about policy makers abdicating, about policymakers being the ones that actually set policy, when you look at what happened during COVID, and this crosses both party lines, President Trump, Governor Cuomo, Governor Newsom, Governor Wolf, Mayor de Blasio, the list goes on and on and on. They basically outsourced the expert advice to people like Dr. Fauci and basically evaded the fact that they are the ones elected and having the authority to weigh the long term versus the short term, to look at competing interests, to figure out how to take expert opinion and integrate it with all of the other priorities of a state, of a city, of a country. And what's happening now is they're blaming the expert because things didn't go the way they wanted. And going back to what Senator Fetterman said, he talked about this economy versus lives framing. And it was very common. It's not just Senator Fetterman that said that. Everybody said that. This is a false dichotomy. The economy is people's lives. And policymakers were elected to integrate expert input with everything else they know, all the other competing interests that I mentioned, and then come up with a unified plan to move forward during an emergency like COVID. Now they're blaming the expert who was an infectious disease or is an infectious disease doctor because he didn't consider all those other things. Whose job was it to consider those other things? Not the infectious disease expert. He's hired to be the infectious disease expert. It's the policymakers. They abdicated. Now they're scapegoating. Another thing I wanted to mention is Jay Bhattacharya, who's the current acting CDC director and the NIH director. He said that Fauci abused power. I think that's really disingenuous because yes, Dr. Fauci had enormous influence, but he didn't actually have the power on the political levers. He wasn't a CDC director. He wasn't a state health department director. He wasn't a governor or mayor. But what does Bhattacharya do with that authority? He is the acting CDC director, so he has that authority. What have we seen him do? We've seen him issue hantavirus quarantine orders for people who posed no public risk. We've seen him quarantine Americans re-entering from Canada at Fort Drum because they had been in the DRC, not in the Ebola zone, just been in the DRC. Dr. Fauci never signed orders like that. So if what Dr. Fauci did was abuse of power, what is Dr. Bhattacharya doing? And I think it is true that Dr. Fauci, being NIAID director, created an empire there, and he had a lot of influence on scientific priorities of NIAID, and who got funded and what were the priorities that were being funded and which ones weren't. And I think that's a legitimate structural critique about government funded science, that it's not going to necessarily always direct research the way a market would direct it. But I don't think you could say that this was kind of on the part of malice or motivated by some nefarious purpose on Dr. Fauci's part. I think he's an unequaled infectious disease mind. So to sum up kind of what I think about this, you've got elected officials abdicating trade-offs that they were put in the office in offices to weigh. One expert in infectious disease doctor becomes the sole author of pandemic policy in the public mind. The public now has forgotten the mayors, the governors, the school board members, and now you have 6 years later an article that or a hearing punishing him rather than actually trying to learn anything about the next time we face an infectious disease crisis. Speaking of infectious disease crisis, there is one in the DRC right now with Ebola. This is the second biggest Ebola outbreak in history. This is the number one Ebola outbreak by speed and trajectory, and it's the third recorded outbreak of the Bundibugyo Ebola species. Just by the numbers, over 3,400 cases, over 1,500 deaths. And just to really concretize the trajectory here, the doubling time is about 20 days. That's very, very fast. Deaths went up by 50% in 1 week. And this statistic, I think, is the critical one. 80% of cases are arising from unknown contacts. That means that all that contact tracing is not even close to getting the majority of the transmission chains kind of known to public health, which means it's going to take a lot more time to actually have their hands around this problem. 60% of deaths are occurring in the community rather than in Ebola treatment centers. Those individuals are very contagious at the time of death, and they're likely going to set off chains of transmission in the community. Because of these two things, the contact tracing, the deaths in the community, there really is an urgent need to kind of configure how people are dealing with the community there, where people have to see the value of using the Ebola treatment units, have to see the value of talking to public health researchers. Because I would say the obstacles here really aren't medical. There's 260 armed groups operating across North Kivu and Ituri, healthcare workers not being paid, they're striking. You're not going to be able to do any of the essential functions of public health under those conditions. On the other side, we have countermeasures moving in real time. And I think that's remarkable and very different from the 2013, 2016 West African Ebola outbreak. We've had, in this outbreak, the first volunteer dosed with the Oxford Bundibugyo vaccine phase 1 trial that's going on in the UK and Uganda. CEPI is now partnering with Merck and a Singapore firm on a Bundibugyo vaccine that's based on the same platform that led to the successful Merck Zaire strain vaccine. Obeldesivir, the oral antiviral, that post-exposure prophylaxis trial underway. That's all kind of breakneck speed going on in the midst of kind of a very dire Ebola outbreak. Uganda was able to control its kind of incursion, the incursion of Ebola into it from this outbreak. They had about 20 cases, and they're in their 42-day countdown to be declared Ebola-free. I don't know exactly where they are in that 42 days because there's some differing numbers on when the last patient was discharged, but we'll see what happens with Uganda. But the thing is that as long as this outbreak continues to fester in the DRC, in those provinces, every bordering country is going to have perpetual vigilance. And if this isn't contained, you basically have a region inheriting an Ebola posture that they have to keep indefinitely because of the risk of cases accruing in their areas. Moving now to Cyclospora. I think the big thing to recognize is that this is not just one big outbreak. There are multiple different things going on. Maybe 4 outbreaks, maybe 6 outbreaks. It's unclear to me. But what you see in the headlines, 11,000 cases, for example, that's a discrete number. And yes, Taylor Farms may be driving a lot of it, but not all of it. There are states that have cases related to international travel. There are states that have cases that might be linked to cilantro, states that might have things linked to parsley. And I think that granularity that we need is not just an academic demand to know exactly what's going on. It's really an economic one, because when you have that uncertainty of which products are contaminated, which ones aren't contaminated, people don't know what to do. They don't know what to avoid, what's okay, and they stop buying produce that might not even be involved. Right now, 40% of Americans are eating less produce, and 47% say they don't trust the FDA. That has to do with this kind of uncertainty that's been characteristic of this Cyclospora outbreak. Then you have a recall that Taylor Farms issued related to bag lettuce that was from one of their affiliated farms in Mexico. They recalled it by alphanumeric lot code. How is that actually good practice? Even if that's what the FDA regulation states, that they can do it that way, that doesn't help people with the uncertainty. That's why people don't trust the FDA, because they're sending out codes rather than saying, this particular brand, the lettuce looks like this, it's in this kind of bag. That's actually what grocers, what people need, not some alphanumeric code. And I think that with such an outbreak like this, you'd expect them to go above and beyond. Taylor Farms spends around $200 million a year on food safety. This seems to be a very low-hanging fruit, no pun intended, that I think really needs some scrutiny. The other aspect of this is that there is this FDA traceability rule. It's been pushed off until 2028. So that means if we had a Cyclospora outbreak in 2027, we would have this exact same chaos again. So just to recap about Cyclospora, just a little bit of the 101. Remember, this is fecally contaminated irrigation water, likely sprayed onto the crop, depositing on the leaf surface, like of the lettuce. And ground level irrigation wouldn't be contaminating in the same way. So that's how these oocysts are getting into the leaves and then getting into your body. And it just takes a few oocysts to infect you, which then turn into like millions of oocysts that are being shed by you, destroying your intestinal lining or inflaming it, which gives you that inflammatory diarrhea. And as you can tell, I don't think the official response has been confidence building. RFK Jr. said this is under control. An FDA deputy commissioner said the food supply is safe, but it will take some time. That doesn't actually make sense. But I don't expect this administration to make sense when it's talking about public health or infectious disease, because RFK Jr. runs this whole. It's important to also remember that this isn't a life-threatening outbreak. It's just a very badly managed one. There was an interview by a county health officer in Washtenaw, Michigan, and she said, quote, "If nationally they don't know what's going on, how are we locally expected to know what's going on?" I think that's really the actual story here, that the CDC is not able to do what it was constituted to do. That division that handled Cyclospora, gone. It's not surprising that you see this. Now, moving on to measles. So the United States has over 2,300 measles cases, already more in 2026 than in all of 2025, the worst year since the early 1990s. And remember, these reported numbers understated. Just looking at the Utah-Arizona border, mathematical models are saying this is 2 or 3x just there. So we're much higher than this if you actually think about what the true burden of measles is. And people keep looking to this elimination decision that's going to happen in November. Is the United States going to maintain its elimination status? I think that's an important metric, but it's the wrong metric. The right metric is the United States resilient to measles? The answer is no. Canada lost elimination status and has had 21 months of continuous transmission. That's endemicity. That's basically where we are now. And the label, whether or not elimination is held or not held, and I don't think it can be held, doesn't change the biology or the epidemiology of what we're facing. What we don't have here is an immunity wall. Certain states might have higher levels of immunity, like Maryland, where there are case counts in the single digits, because what ends up happening is people get infected and the virus runs into a wall of immunity from the vaccine and can't go any further. Most of the country has major holes in those walls. And a virus as contagious as measles is going to find its way right into those networks. And everyone's network is going to have measles in it at some point. I also would say when you look at these state aggregate numbers, that doesn't tell you the whole story. It's school level immunity that matters. That's where the action actually is. And certain schools have very low rates. So for example, in my home city of Pittsburgh, one of the public schools, Concord, has a kindergarten immunization rate of 74% against measles. All that's going to take is one person with measles to get into that school, and that school will be aflame with measles. Even if the overall aggregate vaccination rate in the city of Pittsburgh schools is higher than 74%, it's not going to matter. That 74% itself is basically kindling for an outbreak to start. And people might ask, and they do keep asking, and it's kind of annoying, why do I care that people get measles? Number one, you end up coming to the hospital. You end up taking up space in the hospital, having to use personal protective equipment and protect other patients, and you're putting your child at risk for no reason, and you're going to cost a lot of money. It's probably $100,000 per case in terms of lost productivity, absenteeism, health department investigation costs. And remember, taxpayers are paying for these things. It's not coming out of some fund that grows on trees. It's actually taxpayer money to investigate measles cases that shouldn't actually be occurring. The other thing that I can't stand when talking about measles is that people keep kind of talking about this live or die binary. Oh, if nobody died from measles, it's not a bad thing. My home state alone has over 24 hospitalizations. As I mentioned before, hospitalizations are not benign. They take up hospital capacity. And why would you want your child to be hospitalized when they could be at home doing fine if they got measles vaccinated? Chester County, Pennsylvania, contact tracers are having people hang up on them. This is people really just choosing a lower standard of living because they've been told measles is benign. So it doesn't matter if it's going to be around or not around. It's the same. It's the same standard of living when clearly it's not. It's not on economic terms. It's not on health on health terms, and I think it's not on civilizational terms. Florida right now has 155 cases. What was the historical average? 3.5. Florida, you might remember, has a Surgeon General who is anti-vaccine, Dr. Ladapo. In a recent interview, he said that the measles vaccine happens to work. Quote, happens to work. It doesn't happen to work. It works through a causal biological mechanism. And that phrasing tells you something about how he reasons. Obviously, if you're accepting all these notions about that the anti-vaccine movement throws around, you clearly don't understand causality. You clearly accept the arbitrary into your thinking. And that's why he thinks that the measles vaccine just, quote, happens to work, not that it was actually designed to work based on fundamental scientific principles. Delaware has some of its first cases in a while of measles. But interestingly, after the cases were announced, several dozen people started getting MMR vaccine. So at least some people, when the threat is near, will take protective action, which is a good thing. Countermeasures against measles, antivirals, monoclonal antibodies, those are now becoming economically viable because endemicity is being priced in. Companies are thinking, maybe this is something we should invest in if measles is going to be around. So companies like Invivyd, a research group at Vanderbilt, they're making anti-measles monoclonal antibodies. There are companies making antivirals, as well as academic consortiums making antivirals like GHP 88310 for post-exposure prophylaxis. I wonder, if people who don't want the vaccine, if they're going to accept these countermeasures, because during Utah, there were people refusing post-exposure immune globulin. So we'll see. But the fact that companies are finding this economically viable tells you something. It means that the market is already anticipating endemicity. I want to now talk a little bit more about vaccine policy. So this week we saw the nominees for CDC director and for Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response. So that's Dr. Schwartz and Mr. Kaufman, respectively. They both advanced out of committee, headed towards full Senate votes. So with Dr. Schwartz, I think I'm not reassured that she looks really great on paper. She looks better than me by a lot on paper. Because I think if RFK Jr. did not believe they were aligned or she was aligned with him, he wouldn't have allowed her to go forward. I think that was very visible during her confirmation hearing. With Mr. Kaufman, I think the nomination is a little bit more of a serious concern. This is a person who said he would, quote, rather perish than let his children be vaccinated against COVID. I don't think that was accidental wording. And Senator Cassidy has said this nominee, when he becomes ASPR, is going to be kept away from vaccine decisions. I think that's structurally impossible to keep. The SNS, the Strategic National Stockpile, which stockpiles vaccine, it sits under ASPR. And BARDA, which basically was the architect of Operation Warp Speed, BARDA's director answers to the ASPR. So I'm not reassured that you can actually keep this person isolated. But he's told that probably by RFK Jr. or some RFK Jr. acolyte. And Senator Cassidy seems to believe everything that comes out of there. And what you already see, for example, is companies like Moderna, who are on the cusp of getting a flu vaccine made with mRNA approved, they were holding off on some research to see where the dust settles because it's clearly not a safe environment for mRNA vaccines. And I would just say that Senator Cassidy is responsible for RFK Jr.'s rise, and he keeps accepting these assurances. He's already chosen not to stand with his profession, not to stand with Louis Pasteur, but to stand with politics. Another vaccine policy issue coming up is that Merck is now settling some lawsuits against Gardasil. RFK Jr. is like attorney of record, I believe, on some of those cases. And his son works at a firm or he was referring cases to his son's firm. Whatever his personal share is or isn't, and maybe he's not, neither one, RFK Jr. or his son, are going to get any money from this. This is still an anti-vaccine advocate monetizing decades of maligning a vaccine that is not only safe and effective, but is the key to ending cervical cancer. This is why I say he's nihilistic, because what benefit do you get out of this other than less people getting Gardasil, more cervical cancer, more head and neck cancer? That's what he's advocating for by maligning the Gardasil vaccine. Kind of disappointingly, the White House itself is pushing for more, meaning that President Trump has been asking RFK Jr. to do more to reduce the number of childhood vaccines. This is obviously not a science-based idea. This is a dangerous idea, one that will lead to a lower standard of living. And RFK Jr. doesn't need any encouragement, but it just speaks to the fact of why he's in power. At the state level, there's a whole other front going on. Vaccine bills are getting introduced. They're getting further than they used to, some clearing one chamber, some becoming law. I think of these as trial balloons from the anti-vaccine movement, and they're going to keep getting more and more successful. So it's not just a federal government fight. There's separate fights in state capitals. And NPR is reporting that pediatricians are now telling parents they can't trust the CDC. And I think that's completely reasonable because of who runs the CDC. RFK Jr. runs the CDC. But I do also know that these voices that you see magnified are not the general public. Actually, I read a survey that 1/3 of parents actually advocate that other parents vaccinate their children. The loudest voices are not the majority. The majority is probably still with vaccines, still with science, still with Pasteur. But unfortunately, a dangerous minority has the grips of government power. A few last things I wanted to mention on ectoparasites. So ectoparasites are organisms that live outside you. So scabies, that's an ectoparasite. There was a story about ivermectin mass drug administration in the Solomon Islands in Fiji. Ivermectin worked exactly where it was meant to, against a parasitic disease, an ectoparasitic disease as scabies, not for COVID, not for whatever else they're trying to use it for. And the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette did an interesting article on fleas, and I just wanted to mention something. You know, most fleas don't cause disease processes, although they are responsible for the Black Death, and they can also cause typhus. Most flea bites are going to be innocuous and annoying, especially in many parts of the country or the world where typhus and plague are not endemic, but that's just a little bit on ectoparasites. So to sum up, I wanted to kind of mention an op-ed that was published in CIDRAP, or actually an interview in CIDRAP with Mike Osterholm, who's the founder of CIDRAP, and a real sage when it comes to a lot of infectious disease work. He talked about what causes pandemics, and he used an interesting phrase. He talked about viruses with wings, or angels. And what does that refer to? Efficient transmission through the air. And I think that's really important, because this is something I've been saying for a while, that it's efficiently spreading respiratory viruses, which are the only pathogens that have pandemic potential in the 21st century. And I think when we think about pandemics, there are lots of viruses with wings that we have to worry about. And the Fauci hearing concretizes the cascading impact of getting that wrong, of not being prepared for the next virus with wings, and why it's important to have as much resiliency as possible.